So today I'm going to talk about space and cybersecurity law, and I'm going to do this in the context of national security to some extent. If you have um, happened to have caught one of my space and cybersecurity presentations over the past year, because I seem to have done a lot of them, I'm going to try to do this one in such a way that it speaks a bit more to the national security aspects of this problem. First thing that I should say is that I am a research fellow in cybersecurity governance and regulation. And I split my time between SES and the University of Luxembourg, as was just said. It is obligatory for me to make known that this is a position that is funded by an industrial fellowship from the Luxembourg National Research Fund. And so now that I've said that, we can go on. So I'm going to start actually, so I'd written a different slide. Since I don't have the right slides with me, I'll just make up that slide on the fly here. And the first slide was really this question of what is cybersecurity before we even get into this idea of cybersecurity law. And I think that this is one of the big problems that we have in this area, is this idea that cybersecurity actually is very much something that is in the eye of the beholder. It's the basic idea, and we can all sort of agree on the basic idea, which is about protecting information and networked assets from breaches and attacks. However, if you are in a room full of cybersecurity experts and you're talking to them, you can have really wildly different conversations with each of them, and each of them can be using, very different vocabulary to discuss this thing that is cybersecurity. And I think that one of the reasons for that is that cybersecurity is so prevalent right now. It's everywhere. Everybody has to do cybersecurity. You, as a user of your own technology, you have to do cybersecurity. Organizations have to do cybersecurity, and states have to do cybersecurity. And within each of these contexts, cybersecurity actually just means something a little bit different. And I think that this is important to kind of draw out at the beginning, right? When we're thinking about it, from the user context, it's very much about, me monitoring my email, maybe using a search engine that doesn't follow me quite as much, not clicking on suspicious links, those sorts of things are cybersecurity, making sure that I've run McAfee or whatever software I'm using. But if we're talking about it from an organizational perspective, we're really looking at this a problem of risk management, risk assessment, and risk management, wherein you need to identify the risks that are a threat to you, and you need to be able to mitigate those. But that mitigation isn't complete, right? Your system is never fully secure, but you have to mitigate it adequately. And so we'll see that idea of being adequately cyber secure plays into the realm of cybersecurity a great deal. But if we're thinking about this from a national security aspect, I think things actually change a great deal, because from a national security perspective, we are concerned with protecting, but that risk area gets a lot bigger, right? Because we have to think about protecting not just the systems of a specific base, but or not organizational, government-wide, as well as military-wide systems, as well as the national system itself. Because if we think about national security, the goal is to protect from external threats. That actually is just the general network of the entire nation, and that certainly lays a different twist on how we think about cybersecurity. But on top of that, from a national security perspective, we also need to think about the idea that sometimes you need to coerce other parties, adversaries, to do certain things. And this means that from a national security perspective, cybersecurity actually draws in issues of coercive or offensive or active measures to maintain the security of the nation. And I think that certainly changes the way that we have to think about cybersecurity. Now, I am going to come to this from a legal perspective, as this is a space law presentation or a space law webinar. And so I'm going to look at this from the idea of the law. What is cybersecurity law, and how do we apply that? And I'm going to try to bring in this national security perspective to the extent that I can. The slide deck that I'm working from is very much about sort of cybersecurity law from an organizational perspective, and then draws that into thinking about cybersecurity law within the space domain itself. So now that we are on track with my slide deck here, I'll move forward on that, which, the first question that we have to ask is if we're not really sure what cybersecurity is, or we're sure, we just know that it changes meaning within different contexts. Well, that drives us to this question of what is cybersecurity law? Because one of the things that I've seen just out in the legal field in general, right, is that there is just this inherent gut knowledge that the lawyer has a role in cybersecurity, right? But when you go to figure out what cybersecurity law is, it's a very different, or I guess it's. Let me explain it like this, right? If you type in space law into Google or whatever your preferred search engine is, you'll get back something that is identifiable as a body of law, right? That is space law, and that, body of law is something that probably there is general consensus upon among practitioners as well as academics, right? This, you got the 5 treaties, you get the national legislation. There might be disputes at the edges of space law, but in general, we all kind of agree on what the core space law texts are. If you search cybersecurity law in the same way, it's really gonna, what you get back is gonna depend a lot on how the algorithm is treating you that day, right? Where you're sitting, what you've searched previously, because it's very difficult to identify a core body of cybersecurity law. And this is because cybersecurity law changes a great deal, right? It depends, the great lawyer answer, on your jurisdiction. It depends on the type of data that you are using, on your system specifications, right? What sort of hardware and software are you using, as well as on the user requirements. And so all of these are factors that play into what cybersecurity law means in your particular context, right? And so this is problematic because that means there isn't a universal legal or even technical standard for what the requisite level of cybersecurity is. Which means that cybersecurity becomes bespoke for each enterprise, and space is going to be no different to that. And so we have to begin to think about cybersecurity law in this way, right? And this is often, counterintuitive from the way that we learn to do law. The way that we learn to do law is to go and find the text of the law and apply the text of the law to what we're doing, but we come up empty when it comes to cybersecurity law on the text of the law. It's hard to apply the text of the law when you can't find the text of the law, which means that we really have to move and think about cybersecurity law in different ways. And the way that I like to do it is actually cybersecurity governance, which is something a little bit broader than the law. But as we'll see, right, the lawyer still has a critical role in this. And so this idea of cybersecurity governance still requires us to find sources, right? And there are legal sources that we can look to, right? There's international law, but you're not going to find much there. There is the Budapest Convention on Cybercrime, which is really the only treaty that we have out there that speaks to cybersecurity in any way. And what this treaty does is call for states to harmonize their laws on cybercrime. There is a new African Union Convention on Cybersecurity, but it's not entered into force yet. I haven't actually read the whole thing, but it seems fairly detailed in what it covers. As to whether or not it will enter into force, I don't know. Most of what you see in the international law field is the application of international law that we already have to the cybersecurity domain. And, this is obviously an important exercise. And from a national security perspective, probably the place that stands out the most is in law of armed conflict, as well as the use of force question. And we see, a lively debate on this out there, and sort of the core document that everybody turns to these days is the Talon Manual, and whether the Talon Manual really handles these things well or not. But the thing to remember is that the Talon Manual is taking law that existed well before any cybersecurity concerns were there and applying that law forward. And I think that one of the things that we're going to have to come to grips with at some point is that cyber the cyberspace just creates different functions and different ways of doing things, and international law is going to have to catch up, or it's probably going to get left in the dust a little bit. There is domestic legislation. And I'll come to these on the next slide, some specific examples of domestic legislation. But you'll find that if you go and dig into domestic legislation, and in particular US legislation, if you're an operator trying to do cybersecurity, you're not going to find very many things that tell you what it means to be cyber secure. The domestic legislation just generally doesn't do that, nor do our regulations. And regulations are the next level down from this and often have much more specificity than domestic legislation, but we really haven't seen this promulgate in the regulatory world either. We're seeing more common law coming out on this, and I'll talk about that in a moment as well. But one of the big areas, and we'll come back to this as well, is contracts. Contracts are where a lot of cybersecurity risk is handled, and that is something that the lawyer's hand is in pretty heavily. There are also non-legal sources. There's policy and strategy at the national level. We have technical standards and technical specifications, which help us to configure systems as well as to configure ourselves from an organizational perspective. And then we have good practices, and I use good practices there because we're trying to move away from best practices, which implies that something is the best. But if it's a best practice and we come up with a better practice, was it ever a best practice? So I use good practices. That's side trivia for you. All right. So this is what the takeaway from all that is that cybersecurity law is very diffuse. And it often comes from very unexpected places. And so just to give you a handful of examples here. In the United States, the Federal Trade Commission uses its authority to investigate unfair and deceptive trade practices to investigate data breaches. And they have taken the statutory authority and extended it out over data breaches. And now this has been challenged, as you're really twisting those words there. But the Third Circuit has indeed upheld the FTC's ability to do this. In the EU, we have the GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation. This one is all about keeping personally identifiable information secure. And the idea of PII, this is a type of data, and the GDPR doesn't really say anything about cybersecurity, but the fact that you might have personally identifiable information on your system means that you have to pay attention to GDPR, because if your system is at risk, then you are not cyber secure and you have run afoul of this law. In multiple jurisdictions, there's an emerging rule that a board of directors actually has a fiduciary responsibility with regards to cybersecurity, that they owe not only their fellow contractees or their customers, but their shareholders a duty of care to maintain a requisite level of cybersecurity. And so in lieu of the fact that we don't have these like core cybersecurity laws, we do have sort of these places where cybersecurity law is beginning to emerge. Now, when states do adopt cybersecurity laws, these are often frameworks for government action rather than provisions on what is required, right? So in the U.S., we have a lot of law actually that talks about this. We have the Cybersecurity Information Sharing Act. We have the Federal Information Security Management Act. And there are several with names like these. These laws are very much about federal government information and keeping federal government information secure. Now, this obviously impacts national security, and one of the things that we get out of U.S. law is the idea that the NIST, the National Institute of Standards and Technology, will develop a cybersecurity plan, not only for federal information, but also for critical infrastructure. And we'll come back to the NIST cybersecurity framework, because I think that this is one of the rich places in where we see cybersecurity finally sort of catching, or this, I guess, cybersecurity turning and looking and saying, hey, we should come up with some rules or some standards for the space community or the space industry. Another example of this is just in the EU, we have Regulation 2019-881, which is the ENISA regulation, and this establishes the European Union Information Security Agency, I believe. Yeah, I think that's what it is. It's I'm constantly in a soup of acronyms and I'm constantly forgetting what they mean. But the NIST regulation is very much about, at an EU level, getting states to just adopt cybersecurity strategies, not about telling organizations what they need to do to be cyber secure. So as we can see, rules can be very different across jurisdictions, but some jurisdictions can obviously have global effects. So we just mentioned GDPR. You're all familiar with this because every time you go to a website now and you have to click to accept or deny cookies, that is an effect of GDPR. All of those websites have a connection to the EU and are therefore subject to it. It's also the reason, so I'm sitting in Luxembourg right now, it's the reason that I can't read local newspapers in the US because they're not GDPR compliant. They've just turned off my IP address being able to access them. So there is a global effect from GDPR. And we're also seeing, I mean, just as an interesting side note, GDPR to some extent being adopted in other parts of the world, where we can maybe see some sort of sense of norm entrepreneurship out of GDPR. So Brazil has recently adopted a Data Protection Act. California actually has a state level act that's very similar to GDPR. And as just a really interesting side note, the Chinese cybersecurity law actually imposes GDPR type obligations vis-a-vis an operator and the user, right? Now, obviously in China, that doesn't mean that the government can't get the data, but it actually imposes very strict data protection rules between commercial entities and users, which is interesting to think about. So the problem, right? There is a duty as a reasonable, prudent operator or actor or company, whatever, to secure your information assets in your IT systems, right? And we know this, right? Our gut as a lawyer says, yes, we know that we have to do this, but there's very little legal guidance as to what this means, and a complete lack of regulatory certainty. This is actually one of the core challenges to the FTC's use of its authorities. In that Third Circuit case, which I believe was Wyndham Hotels v. FTC, the challenge was, one challenge was to the extension of the FTC's authority, but the second challenge is, look, fine, if you're going to do this, if you're going to excuse me, use your authority in this way, then you have to tell us. You have to give us some guidance on what it means to be cyber secure. And the Third Circuit didn't require the FTC to do that. But you can see that from an organizational perspective, right? The lack of legal certainty here is very problematic. It's problematic to your business case. It's problematic to your risk exposure. There are lots of reasons that you would want some sort of legal certainty. So I can sum up cybersecurity law to you in one quick sentence, which is that thou shalt be cyber secure. But what does that mean, right? What does it mean to be cyber secure? So let's turn to this idea of doing cybersecurity law, which I think is one of those questions, right? Again, if you go out and you begin to read on cybersecurity law, you're not going to walk away with a good idea of what it means to do cybersecurity law. So let's start with a little bad news, right? Your system just isn't secure, and it will never, ever be secure, right? It can only be secure enough. And so therein lies one of the big problems. If we're thinking about doing a risk assessment, right, and we're trying to mitigate that risk, we still have to do that within the bounds of our own budgets. And this is one of the major complaints that you see from information security teams and cybersecurity teams is we could be more secure, but we don't have the money to be more secure. So you have to balance the risk with the resources that you have to deal with that risk, right? And now cybersecurity is also an ongoing enterprise, right? And it has to constantly be reevaluated. You're never cyber secure in the sense that, like, you finish it, you're at the end of the day and you're like, we did it, we're cyber secure, let's all go have a beer and we don't have to worry about this tomorrow. No, when you get back to work on Monday, you constantly are reevaluating and looking at your systems to try to find places that you can better your cybersecurity stance. And threats and vulnerabilities are everywhere and they are multiplying. And this is sort of the truth that everybody knows, right? As we get more connected, and right now I don't know if we could be much more connected than we are. But as we get more connected, that means that those are all threat vectors, right? If you're running a business and you have one office and it has a single door, right? That's your threat vector, is that door. As soon as you plug in a computer in that office, your threat vector is all over, or your threat vectors are all over the world. Because once you are connected to the network, in feasibly, anybody can get to you if they have the ability to do so from anywhere, right? As long as they have an internet connection. And so it's become more and more difficult to identify all the threats. And it's also difficult to identify all the vulnerabilities, right? Software these days it can be very, very complex. And as we all know, there are holes in it. The SolarWinds hack from this year, it was this year? Yeah, this year, is a great example of that, right? That hit right into Microsoft. And so we see there, and Microsoft is considered to be, fairly reliable software, but there was an exploit that was found and it was used. And so vulnerabilities themselves are very, very hard to identify, especially when you're using third-party software. So cybersecurity, from a legal perspective, is about the principle of CYA, which is, as most lawyers should know, cover your ass, right? From a legal perspective, this means that you need to be able to demonstrate that the company was fulfilling its duties with regards to cybersecurity. And you can do this through a variety of technical and legal mechanisms, right? You can adhere to technical standards and certification. You can build internal policies, contracts with vendors and customers, technical implementations themselves, and then there's logging and penetration testing, where you actually test your system. Now, what's the lawyer doing all this, right? The lawyer is not doing the logging and penetration testing, but the lawyer is making sure that the organization is being compliant, right? That it is doing these things, that it is documenting these things. Because what you want to do is, if you are in a dispute over cybersecurity and you end up in court, you want to be able to roll in with several hand trucks full of boxes of evidence that show that you had internal policies that told people, don't click on those links, don't open emails from these things. This is how you need to treat your passwords. This is how you need to build your passwords, all of these things. You want to be able to show that you had adhered to technical standards and certification and that you have documented this, right? You don't want to have, on the other hand, no paperwork and, an intern up there on the stand going, yes, they asked me to do cybersecurity things and I did cybersecurity things. And yay, that's not going to work, right? So it's about evidence. And this is what the lawyer is often doing, is thinking about this in terms of building a body of evidence that can show that you have been cyber secure. So as I've already said earlier, this really is about the idea of risk assessment and management, right? Cybersecurity requires you to identify and assess risks. And now these risks can be legal, they can be political, they can be technical. Risks come from all sorts of different places. And we'll talk about this in the context of space in a few slides. And then you have to mitigate these risks adequately based on the severity of the risks and the cost of addressing the risk, right? Now, what do I mean by adequately, right? That's the part that's hard to really define. But you want to have the organization in a position to respond to, you want to have the organization in a position where if there is a breach of some sort, if there is an information security incident, that you can essentially show up and say, look, there was nothing we could do about that, right? We did everything that we could do. And the way that they got in was, unforeseeable from our perspective. But this is obviously, you have to balance, right? You have to balance the severity of risk versus the costs. And so, for instance here, if you're expending massive resources on securing the public-facing website of an organization, right? This is probably a bad investment, right? There are a lot of things that you can do pretty cost effective to make sure that your website's secure enough, right? And that's, segregated off from the servers where you're hosting your organizational information, doing basic patching on it. But these are the things that you shouldn't spend a ton of money doing this, because the risks of a hacked website are fairly low, right? But if you don't encrypt the command and control uplink to a satellite because it's expensive, that's likely pretty inadequate, right? You actually have a high risk there because a satellite is a valuable asset, and if that asset gets compromised, well, then you've not only lost a lot of money, but a satellite is something that is existing in a strategic domain. You've put others at risk and possibly put national security at risk. And so when you skimp on that uplink, on that CNC uplink, well, then you're probably not being adequately cyber secure. So let me give an example here of how this idea of certification might work. And the example that I have here is the International Standards Organization 2701 certification. Now, 2701 is a technical standard, and it specifies how you implement an information security management system. Now, this is an interesting thing here, right? We talk about technical standards a lot in the world of cybersecurity, but I often find that lawyers will kind of flippantly say, well, technical standards, but they don't often know what it means to deal with a technical standard. And so this one is an interesting one because it lays out how an organization should go about assessing risk and managing risk through a set of controls that allow an organization to build an IS management system. And just as a quick aside, right, this is information security. I'm talking about cybersecurity. Information and security and cybersecurity don't completely overlap, but if you were doing a Venn diagram, they would mostly overlap. So for our purposes today, I will probably use cybersecurity and information security interchangeably, right? Now, if you get certified in the standard, right, it's a powerful tool. It's a powerful tool in showing contract partners, as well as anybody else that you're partnering with or collaborating with, that your company or your organization is securely managing its information assets. And this alleviates a lot of due diligence burdens when you're doing contracting. And I'm going to talk about sort of military contracting in a moment, or military procurement, because this is something that we see within the space world right now. Is within procurement, we're seeing new emphasis on cybersecurity. So ISO certification is an important tool in this. So this standard details how you develop an ISMS plan, and it works out how to select controls to guide implementation. So one of the big goals within any management plan is choosing the controls that you use. And controls are things like making sure that you have an authorization boundary around your system, right? So if somebody wants to log into your system, they need to be authorized to do so, and they need to have the credentials to authenticate themselves on that system. But the ISO 2701 standard actually, because it's information security, covers a whole raft of things. It's everything from making sure that you have an inventory of the devices, making sure you know who has the devices, the policies that you need to adopt within the system, everything down to like literally locking file cabinets to make sure that there's no unauthorized access to file cabinets, right? And then there are technical implementations of these policies, and so you adopt policies, and then somebody has to implement them technically, and that's usually going to be your IT people. Now, this is a bespoke process, and that I can't say that enough, right? Is this, you customize this to every organization. And this is one of the reasons, right, why we don't have law. That critique that we don't have law isn't really one that's saying that lawmakers aren't doing their job. Right? Law really isn't the place where we work out all of these problems, because it's constantly changing. It's very fluid, and it has to be customized to each organization and each system. So for the ISO 2701 standard, it helps you develop the plan through the assessment of risk specific to the organization. It selects controls that are selected to implement this plan, and then there are technical implementations that are selected to achieve these goals. So as an example of how this might work, right? You identify that you have personally identifiable information on a server. You develop a policy that says you're going to manage that risk by encrypting all of that information in case there is a data breach, right? So if there is a breach, an incident, what the attackers take away is useless to them because it is encrypted. And then the technical implementation, we're going to use RSA encryption to do this, right? Now, you know, going back to that idea of this is why we don't have law on this, right? If Congress came out tomorrow and said everybody's got to use RSA encryption, right? That's the standard now, and they pass a law on that, and then a week later RSA encryption gets broken. Well, now every organization is stuck in this weird place of, do you follow the law and use broken encryption? Do you have to encrypt everything twice, which implements a lot of burdens on your company? And so there is, once with RSA, so you can follow the law, and once with something secure. So there is a strong reasons for why cybersecurity law does not actually tell you how to be cybersecure. Now, as a lawyer, obviously you can't do this alone. You need your information security management team or your IT crowd. They do implement technical implementation. They will often write policies, but the lawyers are going to review internal policies. They're going to ensure proper contract clauses, and they're also going to oversee compliance and making sure that there is documentation of what's being done so that you can prove later on that you have been cyber secure. So I talked about ISO 27001. In the US, we really turned to the NIST framework, which is the National Institute of of Standards and Technology. Their cybersecurity framework was developed for critical infrastructure. So it's while we haven't identified space as critical infrastructure yet, yeah, I think it's highly applicable. There is also a risk management framework developed by the NIST, which is built on the cybersecurity framework. So it does very much the same things, but the RMF is geared towards a broader range of organizations. And this image here is simply the process, right? You identify your risks, you protect against them, you detect incidents, you respond, you recover, and it's a circle because you're constantly doing this. Another image from the NIST cybersecurity framework, right? This is how essentially what you're going to be doing is keeping spreadsheets here, right? You do the identify function, you select categories that fit within that function, that fit your organization, subcategories, and then your informational references, which are usually other standards. And so this is what it would look like for a particular function. Identify with the category asset management. There you see the subcategories. And then over there on the end, you see specific references to things that will help you do this. And in that first square on informative references, you'll actually see ISO IEC 27001 A8111, which is, I believe that A111 is about keeping a list of laws, but I would have to go and double check that. So the other thing this is also from the risk management framework that I think is important, is this is a whole of organization thing, right? This goes all the way up to your executive level. It goes all the way down to your operations level. And it is something that has to be thought of from an organizational perspective, right? You don't just hire a person to do cybersecurity. You actually have to get your whole organization to think about cybersecurity. So by now you should see cyber risks everywhere, and you should be duly terrified. So let's turn to the space industry, right? Well, as we've said over and over, cybersecurity is bespoke, right? And industry requirements can certainly affect what controls need to be implemented, right? So a strong example of this is the financial industry. They have very specific data rules, and the financial industry was an early adopter on making sure that that their information was secure. They saw a great deal of risk in a networked and digitized financial industry, and so they needed to assess and deal with that risk, right? Now, the space industry here is not going to be any different, right? It's currently being marked by a proliferation of satellites that are really taking advantage of network or cyber technologies, very large constellations doing this. We're seeing more and more companies that are leveraging data products. It used to be, your remote sensing satellite would take its images and sell the data, and somebody else would process those. We're now seeing companies that are building their own data products. And so this is bringing more risk into the industry. Internet by satellite, Starlink, the one from Amazon, as well as OneWeb. This actually might allow users to uplink to a satellite in a way that broadcasts never did, right? So if I have that Starlink receiver and I make some modifications, it's possible that I can hack into a satellite, and that is a risk, right? It's broadening the number of threat vectors that you have. Satellites are really valuable targets for states, and cyber allows attacks that avoid the debris problem, right? We should never forget that when you're operating in space, you're operating in a strategic domain. Whatever you do touches on national security of multiple nations. And as a result, that means that there are threats threats coming at your space assets simply because of where you are operating and who you might be operating near. And there are also supply chain threats, right? There's an increased use of commercial off-the-shelf technologies, and COTS in and of itself isn't insecure, but you need to make sure that you are vetting your supply chain properly to make sure that you don't introduce risk from a component that you buy or from software that you buy. So cybersecurity in the space industry, industry rules have really lagged here, right? And this is due in part to really a historical difficulty and remoteness of the space domain, right? This was difficult to do cybersecurity operations in space because you had to connect to the satellite, you had to have heavy duty equipment, but I would suggest to you that the barriers are falling very quickly. You can do all sorts of just pulling down information from satellites now using technology that you can buy at Home Depot. You are seeing more and more ground stations that you can just build from plans on the internet that are open source. Now, the good news is that we are beginning to see industry-specific action that is emerging, right? So, a couple of examples here. We have the Aerospace Industries Association, NAS 9933, which is critical security controls for effective capability in cyber defense. Now, this one is interesting. It's not specifically geared at aerospace components. It's more a whole of organization look at cybersecurity. I've referred to it as ISO 27001 Lite because it kind of covers the same things, but it's significantly shorter. You have the Committee on National Security Systems. They have security standards for US DoD and intelligence communities. Security standards for US DoD and intelligence in the intelligence community, and they have developed a space platform overlay for systems that are going to be working within the military or intelligence ecosystem. We have the Consultative Committee on Space Data Systems. They have standards on space data itself. These generally don't apply to most organizations. The CCSD is very much about making sure that people like NASA and JAXA can share information, but they do have some standards on cybersecurity. We have a U.S. initiative, and this is a private initiative. It's a Space Information Sharing and Analysis Center. It's headquartered in, I believe, Colorado Springs, and this is a place where members of the Space ISAC can share information on cybersecurity threats and vulnerabilities that they find. And this is something that we found very important in cybersecurity in general, is having players share information. And federal law has been adopted explicitly to allow this type of information sharing without getting in the way of antitrust problems. Now, this is one of the slides that I'd updated and apparently didn't email myself. So there are a couple more initiatives that I think are worth noting. The first is IA-PRE. IA-PRE is an infrastructure pre-assessment, and this is something that's being stood up by U.S. Space Force for telecom satellites, for commercial telecom satellite operators that want to bid for contracts within for U.S. government contracts and specifically military contracts. And what IA-PRE does is it has selected, I think it's like 583 controls from the NIST control list, and the NIST control list, I should have had it on my desk. It's like that thick, right? It's a lot of paper. Well, the IA-PRE system has chosen 583 of these controls, and they're requiring, or when it's finally stood up, I think it's still in the processes of being completed, the stand-up of it, but What they will require is that operators that want to bid for contracts go through an audit by a third party that that states, how secure they are and how compliant they are with the NIST framework, and specifically with the controls that have been chosen for IA pre. The final thing that I'll note, and this is like fresh off the press, is a new NIST draft report, which is an introduction to cybersecurity for commercial satellite operations. And this report it's fairly basic, but it talks about how you take that NIST risk management framework or the cybersecurity framework, and you apply it to space systems and what that might look like. So a very interesting document. It's actually still open for comment, I think, until the first week of October. So give it a Google and go find it. The space industry, though, is still very much lagging in this area. And as you probably have seen if you're in space, this is a very hot topic, right? People are talking about how we do space law or how we do cybersecurity in space a lot. So one of the big problems that I think is worth identifying, we're talking about, right, is there's currently no baseline guidance on assessing risk of space systems, right? You see down there at the bottom, right, a university CubeSat and the risks that it face are very different from GovSat, which is a public-private partnership in Europe that provides secure communication capabilities to governments and militaries. But we have risks of all type, right? Risks can come from the type of data that you have. System risk, right? Are you in an orbit that's near a high value asset and you have propulsion? You might actually be at risk from or at a higher risk because someone might see your satellite as a good way to target another satellite. Legal and political risks, right? Can we hack into your satellite and get ITAR data? Well, if we can, there's a big problem there. You're at risk, right? That makes you more vulnerable. So I'm not going to go through each of these, but you can see how each of these might change the risk profile of a particular satellite. And when you are building your system, you have to be thinking about this early on, right? This is something that begins at the design phase and it continues all the way through the life of the satellite until you deorbit it. And so all of these different risk factors have to be assessed. And right now, this is one of the places that I think that we haven't seen a lot of work done is how do we do this risk assessment on satellites, and how does that play out within a cybersecurity framework? Quickly, some good news here, right? Cybersecurity is very flexible and it's adaptable. You can use frameworks like NIST or ISO, and it can really guide the operators in risk assessment management. However, these frameworks are quite general. There does need to be increased information sharing and discussion on specific standards and tools for cybersecure space operations. Insecurity for any one operator can actually mean insecurity for other operators, and this turns into a space debris-esque type issue. There's also needs to be international cooperation on reestablishing rules of non-interference in space. If you've read any of my work, you'll know that I'm super pessimistic on this actually happening. So I'm going to leave that as very unlikely. And I think this has probably been covered in a number of these other webinars. And then finally, as innovation of new applications in space continue, there's going to be an increasing need for cybersecurity, right? And so you can just imagine like the chaos of a hacked Starlink system, right? And that's something to think about, right? If we're mass producing satellites, they're running the same software, they're using the same hardware. It's like hacking into a computer. You know, I've got a computer here running Windows 95. I've got a computer here running Windows 95. I can probably, take advantage of the same vulnerability in both computers. So we have to think about this as we move forward, especially with these mass-produced systems that are building up large constellations. And so one final meme, because I like my memes, I find your lack of cybersecurity disturbing. And that's me. You'll see my email address there, my Twitter handle. Come and find me if you want. And I will stop sharing and go to Q&A.
Well, great, Dr. Blount. Thank you so much for your presentation. We'll now open it up to Q&A. I know that Professor Biller mentioned the Q&A box. If anyone has any particular questions for Dr. Blount, you can go ahead and fill in those questions there. Dr. Blount, since I don't see any questions currently in the Q&A box, oh, no, we do have a question. O'Brien asks, What is shutter control? Could you explain the concept of shutter control, Dr. Blount, and maybe kind of explain why it's important from a cybersecurity perspective?
Yeah, I can. So shutter control is this idea that we have in remote sensing, where if you are going to image something that the government would maybe prefer you not image, or prefer you not disseminate those images of, they have a couple of options, right? They can first, via your license, tell you to not image it, right? Just turn off your camera. Or they can do what would sometimes call checkbook shutter control and enter a sole source contract with you, where they buy all that imagery and it can be released later or kept secret. And we see this from Afghanistan in the early 2000s, right? I believe the U.S. government contracted with Digital Globe and bought all of the imagery while we were deploying U.S. forces there. And that imagery actually got later released by the U.S. government, but it kept it out of the hands of adversaries. So why shutter control might be an issue for cybersecurity? Well, if you've been told not to image something and an adversary hacks into your satellite and begins to image it, you have legal risk there, and now your satellite's doing something that it's not authorized to do. That's real quick, shutter control.
Great, thank you, sir. Obviously, you've discussed the different levels of risk based on different factors related to a satellite. For instance, the physical movement of a satellite that could potentially be hacked, effectively, turning a satellite into an ASAT weapon of sorts. But what I wanted to ask was, do you believe that there ought to be different cybersecurity standards for kind of those different levels of risk? Perhaps one that's a bit lower for something like data, something a bit higher for something involving the command and control of a satellite and the actual physical movement, and how would that work at a legal level?
So I don't know if it's necessarily different standards, but I think the problem is knowing what standards you need, right? I mean, the NIST framework, as I said, it's super robust, right? It is thousands of controls to choose from, and it's actually figuring out which ones you need. And luckily, I mean, in the space domain, we do have some guidance on this, right? We have the Committee on National Security Systems, which has adopted their space overlay. The space overlay is built on that, and the space overlay will allow you to choose the controls that you may need. IA-PRE does the same thing. It identifies specific controls that you may need. Now, the thing here with both of these are that these are for national security systems and federal information systems. That risk is much, much higher than, say, Planet Labs, right? The remote sensing company. They're going to have a different risk profile. And if they were sitting down to choose controls, they might need to choose different controls. And so one of the things that I think that we're actually seeing is what we have right now is a bit more robust on the national security end, in the sense that we at least have these two documents that choose controls that apply to specific types of satellites. Commercial operators don't quite have the same type of guidance, right? Now they do have all the same documentation, they can adapt it, they can do all that, but there isn't we haven't I mean this NIST report that I was talking about is really the first time that I think we're seeing the NIST or the cybersecurity ecosystem in the US sort of step out of national security and step into lower levels of satellite security, or lower levels of satellite cybersecurity. And that's where I think there's still a lot of work to be done.
Question from Professor Biller. Is there anything in the recent executive orders on federal cybersecurity that the Biden administration has promulgated recently that has interesting applicability to space systems from a cybersecurity perspective?
So yeah, this is one of those questions that I always fear it's about something that I haven't read yet. So I have not actually had an opportunity to read the Biden executive order on cybersecurity. That's all right. It's all right. So I'm gonna guess that yes, there probably are several very interesting things in it, and it is on my reading list. So fear not, I will. But I should just note that from that executive level, right? Because this was on that slide that I had updated but failed to email myself properly, was SPD 4, 4, 5, 5. Yeah, I think it's 5. From the Trump administration, Space Policy Directive 5 from the Trump administration on cybersecurity for satellites, which was a really proactive move, I thought, and something that was great to come out of the Space Council, was this idea that we do need to begin to think about this, that this is important, not just for national security reasons, but just simply from the perspective of, if we want a thriving space industry, if we want thriving space activities, this is a problem that really affects the entire industry. And so, while I can't speak to the new executive order, I'm just going to guess that it probably has several interesting things in it. The space policy directive that we saw under the Trump administration was very proactive, and I think it's one of the reasons that we're beginning to see things like this NIST report, and as well as IA pre.
We have a question from Dr. Saeed Mostashar. His question
Hey,
is
Saeed.
the risk profile is the risk profile different for mega constellations? You had mentioned SpaceX's Starlink, various other potential mega constellations related to the provision of internet. But is that risk profile different for these mega constellations? And if so, do we need to revise standards or perhaps have a different set of standards for such constellations?
So yes, I think that mega constellations certainly have a different risk profile, and I think there are a handful of reasons for this. They're being mass produced, first of all. And when you get into mass production, I think that means that if you have a vulnerability, you replicate that vulnerability. When we're thinking of GeoBirds, those are custom built. If you build a vulnerability into it, that vulnerability kind of is only in that one, unless you maybe reuse that software. But mega constellations, very large constellations, you're just pumping those out. They're also, close together and tightly knit, and I think that what we have is the potential for interference with a large constellation to actually interfere with a lot of other space operations. And so I do think that risk profile is different. And I think that, yes, we're probably going to need to begin to think about standards that are very specific to these types of architectures. And from the documentation that I've already talked about, we really haven't gotten there right. It's about taking general standards and applying them to space, which is what most industries do, right? You take general cybersecurity standards and you apply them to your specific case. Very large constellations might be specific enough that there needs to be thought on adopting specific standards to them, simply because they're going to be a prevalent, what's the word that I'm looking for? They're going to be very prevalent in this up there in space, and they have potential to cause a lot of chaos if there's interference with them.
John Bergstresser asks, do you see any current cybersecurity laws, for instance, GDPR, as being accepted as customary international law? Or is this area changing so frequently that it would be a while before we see really the formation of any customary international law?
So I like how he answered the first question with his second question. Absolutely, right? It's changing dramatically all the time. GDPR is certainly, I don't think it's risen to the level of custom. I do think that we're seeing other states follow it. But right now, there's such a divide on cyber, right? And we always talk about sort of the West versus the East, right? How the US views cyber versus how Russia and China view cyber. And is a dramatic divide there that's going to block custom. But I would actually look just at the Atlantic, right? The US to Europe, the approach to what cyber is and how it functions is dramatically different between those two as well. And so I think we are a long way away from seeing any sort of customary international law emerge. And I think that states don't want custom to emerge yet. So we're going to see persistent objectors to new legal norms.
Bruno Renaud asks, what
Hey,
role
Bruno.
for international cooperation, sorry, what role for
You know
international
all these people.
cooperation for space security? And are you skeptical? You have said you are skeptical. But what is that role for international cooperation in terms of cybersecurity for space?
So I think international cooperation is really key, because there does need to be information sharing on this, and actually I think the Space ISAC is a great example of this. Now the Space ISAC it's private, but it is international, right? They have international members. They are sharing information um, uh, uh, within that framework. So yes, I think that international cooperation is going to be critical for increasing space cybersecurity. My skepticism, though, is just right now, we are not seeing we're not seeing cooperative activities at the international diplomatic level. And I link this back to just the more general space security debates, right? We're in this place where sort of, if the U.S. says that this is the way that we should go, China and Russia say no, absolutely not. But if China and Russia come up with an idea on the way that we should go, U.S. says absolutely not. And if that my take on this, and this is totally my analysis, is that all three are very happy with the permissiveness of the space law regime, and none of them are really excited about it changing in any dramatic way. And so this kind of kicking the can down the road thing that they do is one in which they are preserving their own freedom of action. And I think that all three states are doing this. And so I think that cybersecurity plays into this, and maybe at an even bigger level, right? I've argued before outside the area of space is that one of the things that we see in the world of cyber is the way in which it opens up sort of this gray space, right? And so if we think about like Article 2.4, which drew this line in international law, right? You don't use force, that's illegal. You can do other things that don't rise to the level of force, but Article 2.4 is that line. And I would argue that cyber is weirdly opening up this gray space in the middle, where states are beginning to be able to do things that kind of look like force, but kind of aren't force. And it's that cyber is actually allowing somebody, sitting at a desk somewhere to reach inside another state and manipulate information as well as manipulate physical infrastructure. And the ambiguity that exists there, if you're a superpower, is awesome. We love ambiguity in those contexts. So yeah, I'm very skeptical that we're going to see major movement in this. At the same time, I think there are other avenues for international cooperation that sit outside of those diplomatic processes, like the Space ISAC, that can have a meaningful and positive contribution to growing the body of what makes something cyber secure in space.
Dr. Blount, I'll turn it over to you for any final words and comments before I give a brief extroduction. So,
Thou shalt be cyber secure.